Dear viewers, the following stories are inspired by real events. However, the names of the characters have been changed to protect privacy. Story 1. The Perfect Marriage Drama. February 2025. In a quiet residential area in Scottsdale, Arizona, the early morning sunlight shines through the windows of a two-story Mediterranean-style house. Inside, Mark, a man in his 40s with neatly cropped hair and a gentle smile, is preparing breakfast for his wife, Sarah, 38, a woman with a delicate appearance, but her eyes always contain an indescribable sadness. The clacking of knives and cutting boards as Mark cuts fruit, and the gentle sizzling of fried eggs create a warm kitchen space. Mark hums a familiar tune softly, his eyes lovingly looking towards the hallway, where Sarah often appears after her morning yoga practice morning. Sarah walked into the kitchen, wearing an ash-gray workout outfit, her chestnut brown hair tied up at the nape of her neck. She smiled slightly at Mark, but that smile couldn't hide the paleness on her face and the dark circles under her eyes. "Good morning, honey," she said, her voice a little hoarse, then sat down on a stool at the kitchen table. Mark placed a plate of fresh fruit and a half-cooked fried egg in front of his wife, asking kindly, "Did you not sleep well? You don't look well." Sarah nodded slightly, taking a sip of green tea. "I had strange dreams again, Mark," she said, her eyes looking out to the backyard, where the cacti were stretching out to catch the sun. Mark placed his hand on his wife's hand, his voice gentle. "I guess you're just busy with the new project lately. Don't think too much." But when Sarah wasn't looking, a cold glint flashed across his eyes, like a snake stalking its prey. About a month ago, Sarah accidentally heard a phone call between Mark and a strange woman. He talked about a large insurance amount, about insuring a secure future, and kept mentioning her name. Sarah asked Mark about the call, but he just laughed and explained that it was related to his business. However, since then, Sarah began to feel uneasy. Mark seemed to be too concerned about her health. He often reminded her to take vitamins, eat on time, and even prepared dishes himself, which he had never done before. But at the same time, he often asked about the details of the life insurance contract, which she had signed not long ago, especially about the payment terms in case of risk. One night, when Mark said that he had to go on a business trip to Los Angeles early the next morning, Sarah could not sleep. Her intuition told her that something was wrong. Waiting until Mark was fast asleep, Sarah gently got out of bed and secretly opened her husband's laptop. She was horrified to see his browsing history. A series of search terms appeared before her eyes, like cold knives, how to cause a car accident alone, drugs that cause symptoms similar to a heart attack, murder case to get insurance without a trace. Sarah's heart beat wildly. Her breathing became rapid. The vague suspicions for a long time had become an extreme horror. The husband she loved and trusted might be planning to kill her. Fear was like a poisonous snake wrapped tightly around Sarah's heart. She began to live in constant doubt and anxiety. Every time Mark touched her, she felt a chill run down her spine. His sweet words, his kind gestures now sounded like horrible lies. She tried to seek help from her best friend, but was afraid that Mark would find out and take action before she could escape. Sarah felt completely alone and helpless, in the very house that she had once considered her happy paradise. Darkness seemed to be covering everything around her. On a Wednesday afternoon, when Sarah was driving her white SUV on Highway 101, to the shopping center in Scottsdale. Her car suddenly shook violently and lost control. Crashed straight into the concrete median. The terrifying collision sound echoed throughout the area. Sarah was lucky to only suffer minor injuries to her arms and head. But the car was severely damaged in the front. Mark received the news and rushed to the scene of the accident. He hugged Sarah. His face was extremely worried and kept asking if she was hurt anywhere. But in his deep eyes, Sarah saw a glimpse of her husband's disappointment, as if his plan had not gone smoothly. Sarah was even more convinced that this was not a random accident, but a carefully calculated plot. That night, when Mark was fast asleep, after a long day of worrying and caring for Sarah, she gently took her husband's cell phone, which was on the nightstand. With a trembling finger, she unlocked the phone with his fingerprint. Sarah searched through the inbox, and was horrified to find a text message sent the night before. The content made her blood stop. "It's all done. Just need to create another accident, and it's done." The sender was an unfamiliar phone number, which Sarah had never seen before. Her hands were shaking so much that she almost dropped the phone. Hot tears rolled down her cheeks. Sarah knew that her life was in serious danger. She had to act immediately, before Mark could carry out his cruel murder plan. Sarah sat motionless on the bed. Mark's phone was still shaking in her hand. That short, but deadly text message haunted her mind. "It's done, everything is done. Just need to create one more accident, and it's done." Her heart was pounding as if it was about to jump out of her chest. Fear spread throughout her body, paralyzing her. But then, a thought flashed through her mind. She couldn't just sit still and wait to die. She had to do something. Had to escape from this evil husband. Sarah gently put Mark's phone back in its place, trying to take deep breaths to calm down. She needed a plan, a way out. But in this house, every corner seemed to be hiding danger. The next morning, Mark returned from his business trip earlier than expected. He walked into the house with a big smile on his face, hugged Sarah and asked her kindly, "Honey, I'm back. Did you miss me? How are you after the accident the other day?" His sweet voice now sounded fake and scary. Sarah tried to reply with a forced smile. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Breakfast was carefully prepared by Mark, but Sarah couldn't swallow a single bite. Every gesture of his concern, from picking up food for her to asking about her sleep, made her feel disgusted. She knew that it was all just an act, part of his cruel plan. In the following days, Sarah tried to act normal. She pretended not to know anything, even showed gratitude for Mark's care. But inside, she was secretly collecting evidence. She secretly recorded their conversations with her mobile phone, recorded Mark's ambiguous questions about insurance, his fake words of concern. She also secretly took photos of the call history and text messages on her husband's phone, hoping to find more information about the mysterious contact person. Every night, when Mark was fast asleep, Sarah would grope in the dark, rummaging through his office, looking for any trace that could expose his true face. One evening, while Sarah was preparing dinner in the kitchen, Mark suddenly walked in and offered to help her. He came closer, his arms wrapped around her waist from behind. Sarah shivered when his cold hand touched her stomach. "Honey, you're so absent-minded these days," Mark said, his voice whispering into her ear. "You almost fell down the stairs the other day. Luckily I caught you in time." Sarah suddenly remembered. That morning she was rushing downstairs to get her things. Suddenly, she felt like someone pushed her back lightly, causing her to almost lose her balance. At that time she just thought she slipped. But now, when she heard Mark mention it again, she couldn't help but wonder. Was it another accident that he had intentionally created? Unable to bear it any longer, Sarah decided to seek help from her best friend, Jessica. After many days of mental struggle, she made an appointment to meet Jessica at a deserted cafe in the city center. When she heard Sarah recount everything, from her initial suspicions to the terrible evidence she had collected, Jessica couldn't help but be shocked and terrified. "Sarah, are you sure? Mark can't be that kind of person," Jessica said, her voice trembling. But when she saw the screenshots of the messages and heard the recordings Sarah gave her, her face turned pale. "Oh my God, Sarah, you have to leave immediately. He's really dangerous." Mark began to notice a change in Sarah's behavior. She became more reserved and quiet, often going out under the pretext of meeting friends. He began to suspect that she had discovered something. One evening, when Sarah had just returned home after meeting Jessica, Mark stopped her at the door. His eyes were cold and full of scrutiny. "Where are you going, Sarah? I called you several times but couldn't get through," he asked. His voice was harsh. Sarah tried to stay calm. "I'm just going to see Jessica for a bit," she replied, trying to avoid her husband's eyes. "Jessica? Is there something you can't tell me?" Mark moved closer, his voice threatening. "I'm your husband, Sarah. We have no secrets from each other." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in bed. Jessica's warnings echoed in her head. She knew that she had to act quickly. But what should she do now? Call police? Escape? Suddenly, a strange noise came from Mark's office downstairs. Sarah quietly got out of bed, gently followed the stairs downstairs. The office door was slightly open. Yellow light shone out. And then, Sarah saw a horrifying scene that made her speechless. Mark was sitting in front of the computer. On the screen was the website of a company specializing in providing hiring killer services. And next to him was a thick document. On the first page, the words "contract" were written in bright red ink. Below was Sarah's name and the huge amount of life insurance clearly displayed under the yellow light. Sarah's heart felt like someone was squeezing it. A chill ran down her spine. She felt like she was standing on the brink of death. Just one more step and she would fall into the dark abyss. But then, a flame of hatred flared up in her heart. No, she would not let him achieve his goal. She would fight to the last breath. Sarah gently closed the door of the study, trying to keep her legs from shaking as she returned to the bedroom. She lay down on the bed, pretending to be fast asleep. But in her mind, thousands of thoughts were struggling. What should she do now? Confront Mark? Run away? Call the police? But she had no solid evidence. Only suspicious messages and search history. Would the police believe her? And if Mark knew that she had discovered his secret, how dangerous would he be? Sarah felt like a cornered rat, with no way out. The next morning, Mark still acted normal. He prepared breakfast for Sarah like every day. But his eyes seemed more probing. He kept glancing at Sarah, as if trying to read her thoughts. "Honey, you seem a little nervous? Did you not sleep well last night?" Mark asked. His tone was so fake that it made Sarah want to vomited. I'm just a little tired." Sarah tried to answer as naturally as possible. She looked straight into Mark's eyes, trying to find a trace of conscience in him, but only saw a cold and terrifying calculation. Sarah secretly contacted Jessica and told her friend about what she had seen. Jessica was extremely worried and advised Sarah to call the police immediately. But Sarah was still hesitant. She was afraid that without solid evidence, Mark would deny everything and even blame her. Jessica offered to help Sarah collect more evidence. She said that she had a friend who worked in the IT field, who could help them recover the deleted data on Mark's computer. A glimmer of hope flashed in Sarah's heart. On a Friday evening, when Mark said that he had to go to an important client outside the city, Sarah knew that this was her best chance. Right after Mark left leaving the house, Jessica arrived with her tech friend. They quickly set to work recovering data on Mark's computer. And then, they found not only suspicious search histories, but also emails exchanged with a person named Silas, in which Mark had agreed on the price and payment method for removing Sarah. The cold and cruel lines appeared on the screen like a steely indictment. At that moment, Sarah heard the familiar sound of Mark's car entering the house. He had come back earlier than expected. Sarah and Jessica quickly turned off the computer and tried to cover up all traces. But it was too late. Mark had opened the door and walked into the office. His eyes darkened when he saw Sarah and Jessica standing there. "What are you doing here?" he growled, his voice full of threats. Sarah tried to stay calm. We just came to visit each other," she said, but Mark didn't believe it. He approached. His eyes seemed to swallow both of them. "Really? So what is this?" He pointed at the computer that was still lit on the table. In that moment of extreme tension, Sarah took action. She rushed towards the door, trying to escape, but Mark was faster. He grabbed her hand and pulled it back. A shiny kitchen knife suddenly appeared in his hand. "You know everything, right?" He gritted his teeth, his voice full of hatred. "Then I won't let you live to denounce me." Mark raised the knife high, preparing to stab down. Sarah closed her eyes tightly, waiting for the fateful stab. But then, a loud scream rang out. Jessica rushed in to attack Mark from behind. The heavy brass table lamp slammed down on his head. Mark fell to the floor. The knife fell from his hand. The police stormed into the house right after. The siren echoed throughout the neighborhood. Sarah collapsed, hugging Jessica. Both of them were trembling, tears rolling down their cheeks. Finally, this horrible nightmare was over. Story 2, Bong Demo, Denver. Late autumn 2025. In a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado, the yellow leaves rustled in the cold wind. In a cozy wooden house with soft yellow lights shining from the windows, Michael, a man about 35 years old with a gentle appearance but his eyes sometimes flashed with an incomprehensible coldness, was playing with his little daughter, Lily, 6 years old, a girl with golden hair and a smile as bright as the sun. Jessica, Michael's wife, was busy preparing dinner in the kitchen. The sound of pots and pans gently colliding created a peaceful family scene. But hidden deep inside was an atmosphere of tension and insecurity. A few weeks ago, Jessica accidentally found a strange notebook in Michael's desk drawer. Inside were scribbled handwritings, listing in detail the types of poisons and lethal doses, along with notes on the time of effect and how to hide traces. Jessica's heart stopped beating when she saw those lines. She tried to question Michael, but he just smiled and said that it was just a random notebook for a writing project he was working on. However, since then, Jessica has always felt that there is a dark shadow looming over her family. Michael began to behave strangely. He often stayed up late to work on the computer. But whenever Jessica came near, he quickly turned off the screen. She also noticed that he often watched videos on YouTube about mysterious murder cases and how to commit the perfect crime. One time, Jessica even heard Michael mumbling to himself in the office about a perfect plan and large insurance money. Those words made Jessica shiver. Her intuition told her that Michael was hiding a terrible secret. One afternoon, when Jessica was taking Lily for a walk in the park near her house, a car suddenly sped towards them. Jessica quickly pulled Lily close. Both mother and daughter narrowly escaped death. Michael later appeared very worried and scolded the other driver. But Jessica noticed something strange. Right after the incident happened, Michael's eyes flashed with disappointment, as if he had expected a different outcome. Jessica could not forget that look. It made her feel cold to the bone. Jessica could not keep this secret to herself anymore. She decided to call her sister, Sarah, a coincidence in name, and told her about her worries and doubts. Sarah was shocked when she heard Jessica's story. She advised her sister to be careful and find a way to protect Lily. Sarah also promised to go to Denver immediately to help Jessica. Her sister's words of encouragement helped Jessica feel stronger, she knowing that she was not alone in this fight. A few days later, Michael suddenly mentioned increasing his life insurance. He said that it was to ensure Jessica and Lily's future if anything happened to him. His tone was sincere and full of love. But Jessica felt a chill. She remembered the words in the notebook, and Michael's recent strange behavior. All seemed to be painting a terrifying picture in her mind. Did Michael really care about her and her daughter? Or was this just part of his cruel plan? One night, when Michael was fast asleep, Jessica gently got out of bed and sneaked into her husband's office. She opened the desk drawer and found the suspicious notebook. This time, she not only saw the words about poison, but also discovered a photo of Lily sleeping soundly. Below the photo was the words, "The ultimate goal." An extreme horror enveloped her Jessica. She knew that Michael not only wanted to kill her, but was also aiming for her little daughter. Tears streaming down her face, Jessica hugged the notebook tightly to her chest. She had to save Lily. At all costs, Jessica hugged the notebook tightly to her chest. Her breathing was rapid. The words and pictures were like sharp blades cutting into her heart. The ultimate goal. Those words haunted her mind. Lily, her little daughter, was sleeping soundly in the next room, completely unaware of the lurking danger. Jessica knew that she had no time to hesitate. She had to act immediately to protect her daughter. She gently put the notebook back into the drawer, trying to calm herself down. She needed to think clearly, to come up with the safest plan. Michael returned home around 10 o'clock at night. He seemed tired after a long day of work. He walked into the living room, where Jessica was sitting pretending to watch TV. "Hello, honey. I'm home," he said, his voice a little hoarse. Then he approached and placed a kiss on her forehead. "Lily is asleep?" Jessica nodded, trying to force a smile. "Yes, brother. She slept very well." In Michael's eyes, Jessica still saw the familiar gentle look. But now, she couldn't shake off the feeling of horror. She knew that behind that smile was a cold and calculating heart. In the following days, Jessica tried to act as if nothing had happened. She still took care of Michael and Lily as usual. But inside, she was secretly preparing for her escape. She began to secretly pack some of Lily's personal belongings and clothes into a backpack. She also found a way to contact Sarah, her younger sister. and told Sarah about her horrifying discoveries. Sarah was very worried and said that she would drive to Denver immediately to help Jessica and Lily. One morning, when Jessica was preparing breakfast for Lily, Michael suddenly walked into the kitchen. He approached his daughter and picked Lily up. "Daddy will give you pancakes, my princess," he said, his voice full of love. But when he gave the pancake to Lily, Jessica was startled when she saw a strange white powder sprinkled on it. Her intuition told her that something was wrong. She quickly snatched the pancake from Lily's hand and pretended that it was burnt. Michael seemed a little surprised, but then laughed and said that he would make another one. Jessica did not dare to think of the worst, but she knew that Michael was becoming more and more dangerous. Sarah arrived in Denver that evening. She hugged Jessica and Lily tightly. The three women sat together in the living room, discussing the planned escape. Sarah learned about some domestic violence shelters nearby, and they decided to go to one of them the next day. Jessica felt a glimmer of hope in her heart. She believed that with her sister's help, she and Lily would be safe. A few days later, Michael began to suspect a change in Jessica's behavior. She became less talkative, and often avoided him. He also noticed that Sarah often came to the house, and the two sisters often whispered to each other. One evening, when Sarah had just left the house, Michael stopped Jessica at the door. His eyes were cold and full of scrutiny. "What are you and Sarah plotting?" he asked. His voice was harsh. Jessica tried to keep calm. "We were just talking normally, honey," she replied. But Michael didn't believe it. He moved closer, grabbed her hand tightly. "Don't try to deceive me, Jessica. I know you're hiding something." That night, Jessica and Lily were sleeping soundly in the living room, on the folding bed that Sarah had brought. Suddenly, Jessica woke up by a strange noise. She opened her eyes and was horrified to see Michael standing at the door of the room. In his hand was a large sledgehammer. His eyes were bloodshot and full of madness. "I finally found you," he hissed, his voice hoarse, then raised the hammer high, preparing to strike down. Jessica screamed in horror, hugging Lily tightly. She knew that this was the last moment of her life. Jessica screamed in horror, hugging Lily tightly, trying to shield her daughter from Michael's raised death hammer. Lily woke up by her mother's scream. The little girl rubbed her eyes. Her face looked at her father with a bewildered look of fear. Michael hissed nonsense. His face was distorted. The veins on his neck stood out, looking like a devil in human form. The sledgehammer in his hand trembling, ready to strike at any moment. Jessica felt her heart stop beating. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that this could be the last moment of her life and her daughter's. Just as Michael was about to swing the hammer down, Sarah from the next room rushed out like a gust of wind. She shouted loudly, attracting Michael's attention. He turned around. His bloodshot eyes turned to look at Sarah. Taking advantage of that moment, Jessica quickly pushed Lily to the end of the bed, signaling her to hide behind the large wardrobe in the corner of the room. "You run," Sarah shouted at Jessica, then rushed straight at Michael, trying to distract him. A terrifying struggle took place in the small living room. Michael, with the strength of a madman, pushed Sarah to the floor. He growled like a wild animal, trying to crush her. Jessica stood up trembling. She looked around looking for something that could be used as a weapon. Her eyes stopped at the brass table lamp placed on the shelf nearby. Without hesitation, she grabbed it and rushed towards Michael, bringing the lamp down hard on his head. Michael let out a painful scream. He let go of Sarah and held his head. Blood started to flow from the wound. But his madness did not seem to lessen. He turned around, his eyes full of hatred, looking at Jessica. Then picked up the sledgehammer that had just fallen to the floor. "I will kill both of you," he roared. Then rushed towards Jessica, the hammer raised high as if to tear the air. Jessica screamed loudly. She knew that she could not resist his strength. Just when danger was approaching, Lily, the petite girl with big, round eyes, suddenly rushed out from behind the wardrobe. The little girl took out a small pair of gardening scissors, which she often used to cut flowers. With all her strength, Lily stabbed the scissors into Michael's leg. He let out another painful scream, staggered back. The sledgehammer fell to the floor with a terrifying sound. Jessica hurriedly ran over to hug Lily. Both mother and daughter trembled in each other's arms. The sound of police sirens echoed throughout the neighborhood. Sarah managed to call 911 while Michael was struggling with her. The police rushed into the house, quickly restrained Michael, who was screaming and struggling. Blood was flowing from his head and from the wound on his leg. He kept babbling nonsense about insurance money and a rich future. Jessica and Lily were taken out of the house. Both were shocked and scared. But in the end they were safe. A few days later, Michael was charged with premeditated murder and many other crimes related to domestic violence and insurance fraud. He faced a severe sentence by the law. Jessica and Lily were moved to a safe house, where they could start rebuilding their lives. The mental scars would probably follow them for the rest of their lives. But they had survived a terrible nightmare, and the love between mother and daughter became strength, helping them overcome all difficulties. Dawn has risen after the dark night. But the terrifying memories of the darkness in Denver will forever haunt them. Story 3. I Want to Kill My Mother in Pennsylvania. In the early spring of 2025, in a sleepy little town deep in rural Pennsylvania, where the fields were still covered in a thin layer of frost, and the bare trees were just beginning to sprout their first buds, Arthur, a man in his 50s with a thin figure and a face that always carried a melancholy look, lived with his old mother, Martha, in an old wooden house that was stained with time. Martha, an old woman in her 80s, whose health was increasingly deteriorating and she was confined to a wheelchair. Recently, she decided to increase her life insurance, and the only beneficiary was none other than Arthur, her only son. In recent weeks, Martha began to feel that something was wrong in the house. She often heard strange noises at night, the sound of soft footsteps on the wooden floor, vague whispers coming from Arthur's room. At first she thought it was just because of old age that her hearing had become more sensitive. But then the events, strange things kept happening. Her favorite scarf suddenly disappeared and reappeared in an unexpected place. Her painkillers seemed to wear off faster than usual. And sometimes the glass of milk she drank at night had a strange, bitter taste, making her uncomfortable. Arthur always appeared to be a devoted son. He took good care of his mother, from preparing meals, helping her with her personal hygiene, to taking her to regular medical checkups. But Martha still felt that there was something fake in his concern. Sometimes, when she looked into Arthur's eyes, she saw a cold and calculating look, as if he was waiting for something. She also heard him talking to someone on the phone. His tone was very gentle but contained a strange eagerness when mentioning large sum of money and final liberation. One evening, while Martha was sitting alone in the living room, Arthur walked in with a forced smile on his face. holding a glass of pale yellow water in his hand. "Drink some of this to help you sleep," he said. His voice was frighteningly sweet. Martha felt a sense of unease rising in her heart. She remembered the bitter milk the day before. She suspected that Arthur was trying to put something in her food and drink. "No, thank you, I'm not thirsty," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. Arthur seemed a little disappointed, but he quickly hid it and said that she should rest early. Betty, a kind neighbor who often visited Martha, began to notice a change in Arthur's attitude. He had always been respectful and loving towards his mother, but recently, Betty felt that he seemed to be losing his patience and becoming more irritable towards Martha. One time, Betty even heard Arthur scolding his mother over a trivial matter, which made her very surprised and worried. Betty also knew that Martha had just increased her life insurance, and she began to feel that something was wrong. One morning, Arthur called Betty to tell her that Martha had fallen in the bathroom and was very weak. Betty rushed over to Martha's house and found her lying motionless on the bed, her face pale and her breathing weak. Arthur explained that his mother had slipped because the floor was slippery. But Betty noticed a large bruise on Martha's arm, as if she had been grabbed by someone. Betty's suspicions grew big. A few days later, a distant relative of Martha, Mr. George, came to visit her. Mr. George was a very careful person, and always cared about Martha. After hearing her talk about the strange things that had happened, Mr. George decided to secretly install a small camera in Martha's living room. What the camera recorded horrified Mr. George. The video showed that Arthur had repeatedly put a white powder into Martha's food and drink. In a terrifying scene, Arthur held his mother's arm tightly when she tried to resist. Mr. George knew that he had to act before it was too late. After watching the terrifying video, Mr. George could not sleep all night. The image of Arthur secretly putting drugs into Martha's food and his violent actions haunted his mind. He knew that he had to act immediately. He could not let Martha continue to live in such danger. Early the next morning, Mr. George decided to call the town's sheriff. He explained regarding his suspicions, and talking about the video he had captured. The chief of police initially seemed a bit skeptical, but upon hearing Mr. George's detailed description, and the promise of providing evidence, he agreed to send an officer to investigate. Arthur seemed to notice something was different. After George's visit, he became irritable, and kept a closer eye on Martha. He avoided leaving her alone as much as possible, and often checked to see if she was talking to anyone. One afternoon, when Martha tried to talk to Betty through the window, Arthur suddenly appeared, and roughly pulled her into the house. "Don't talk nonsense with the neighbors anymore," he shouted, his voice full of anger. "They're just curious about our house." Martha was scared and silent. She knew that Arthur was getting more and more out of control. After reporting to the police, Mr. George still felt worried about Martha's safety. He decided to go to Mrs. Betty to tell her what he had discovered. Mrs. Betty could not help but be shocked and terrified when listening to Mr. George's story. She also recounted the strange things she had witnessed recently. Both of them agreed that Arthur was plotting to harm Martha. They decided to monitor Arthur's actions together, and collect more evidence to hand over to the police. One night, Mrs. Betty happened to see Arthur secretly carrying a small bottle containing brown liquid to the back of the house, and pouring it into the garden. Mrs. Betty felt suspicious, so she secretly dug up some soil there, and took it for testing. The results showed that the soil contained a very toxic pesticide. This drug can cause symptoms similar to illness in the elderly, if used in small doses for a long time. Betty couldn't help but shiver. She knew that Arthur was trying to kill her mother, slowly and quietly. Although her health was getting worse, Martha still tried to find a way to signal to the people around her to know about her dangerous situation. One time, when Arthur went out to buy things, she tried to write a small note with the words, "Save me," and put it in the biscuit, which Betty often brought to her. When Betty received the biscuit, she was extremely heartbroken when she saw the scribbled words. She knew that Martha was asking for help. Arthur began to suspect that someone was following him. He became more vigilant, and often checked around the house. One evening, when he was rummaging through the living room, he suddenly discovered a small camera, which Mr. George had secretly installed. Anger flared up in Arthur's heart. He knew that all his actions were recorded. He had to quickly action before being exposed. Martha was in a very dangerous situation. That night, a huge storm suddenly hit the town. Thunder rumbled and rain poured down. In the pitch-black darkness, Arthur quietly walked into Martha's room. In his hand he held a pillow. His eyes were cold and lifeless. Martha looked weakly at her son. She knew that this was the last night of her life. Arthur approached the bed. He didn't say a word, just held the pillow high. Arthur stood still by the bed. The soft but deadly pillow was in his hand. His eyes were empty, without a trace of emotion. Martha looked weakly at her son. Her old eyes were filled with fear and disappointment. The sound of thunder echoed throughout the house. Lightning flashes tore through the pitch-black night, casting ghostly shadows on the moldy wall. "Arthur, what are you doing?" Martha whispered softly, her voice weak like a sigh. Arthur didn't answer words. He slowly lowered the pillow, covering his mother's wrinkled face. Just as Arthur was about to press the pillow down, a loud noise came from the front door. The rotten wooden door was kicked open. Mr. George and Mrs. Betty, soaked in rain, stood frozen in the doorway. "Arthur, stop right there," Mr. George shouted loudly, his voice full of anger. Arthur jerked back, his face showing shock and anger. "What the hell are you two doing here?" he growled. The pillow in his hand fell to the floor, taking advantage of Arthur's carelessness. Mrs. Betty quickly rushed to Martha's bedside. She hugged the trembling old woman into her arms, trying to shield her. Mr. George walked towards Arthur, his eyes unwavering. "I know everything, Arthur," Mr. George said, his voice resolute. "I've already called the police. They'll be here soon." Arthur sneered. "You have no evidence," he said, his voice full of challenge. But there was an unconcealable anxiety in his eyes. Suddenly, Arthur rushed towards the back door, trying to escape before the police arrived. Mr. George quickly chased after him. The two men struggled in the dark hallway. The thunder and rain drowned out all the sounds. All the while, Mrs. Betty tried to calm down the extremely frightened Martha. "It's okay, Martha. Everything will be fine. The police are coming soon," Mrs. Betty said, her voice gentle but unable to hide her anxiety. The sound of police sirens echoed in the stormy night. The flashing blue and red lights illuminated the entire garden. The police rushed into the house, quickly subduing Arthur, who was struggling with Mr. George. He was handcuffed and led out in the pouring rain, his face full of hatred and despair. Martha was checked by the medical staff healthy. She was still very weak, but she was out of danger. In the damp and cold wooden house, Only the sound of the rain was left. Mrs. Betty hugged the trembling Martha tightly. Mr. George stood beside her, sighing with relief. "Finally, it's all over," he said, his voice hoarse. Martha nodded slightly, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Thank you too," she whispered, her voice choked. "If it weren't for you two, I might have." She didn't finish her sentence. But everyone understood. A few months later, Arthur was brought to trial and sentenced to life in prison for attempted murder and many other crimes. Justice was finally served. Martha was transferred to a better nursing home, where she was well cared for. Mrs. Betty and Mr. George visited her often, and they became close friends. Although the horrible memories of the time she lived with Arthur still haunted Martha, she found peace in the final days of his life. The dawn has dispelled the darkness. But the story of Arthur's greed and cruelty will forever be a warning to those who still harbor dark intentions.